Speaker of class name.
Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Zaheer Ahmed will defend the academic thesis, Statistical Inference for Maximal Interaction Two-Mode Clustering. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you very much, Honorable Pro-Rector. Statistical inference for maximal interaction two-mode clustering is the topic of my dissertation. Before going to discuss maximal interaction in two-mode clustering, first I would like to explain you the notion of interaction in simple two-way layout design with the help of hypothetical example. There are two factors in this hypothetical example. First factor is type of psychotherapy with two levels. As you can see, behavior therapy versus cognitive therapy. The second factor is a type of patients with two levels, highly cooperative patients versus modestly cooperative patients, and the level of well-being measured for each combination of these two factors is the outcome variable. The data pattern in each graph correspond to the mean level of well-being measured for each combination of these two factors. In this figure, in panel A, shows there is no interaction between type of psychotherapy and type of patients because slope of the two lines, as you can see, is same. So the differences, mean differences in highly cooperative group of patient is same as mean differences in a modestly cooperative group of patients. In contrast, graph B shows some interaction because, as you can see, slope of the two lines are not same. So mean differences in highly cooperative group of patient is not same as mean differences in modestly cooperative group of patients. This thesis deals with interaction in two-mode data. So first I would like to explain you what two-mode data looks like, and here I present two-mode data in the form of a rectangular table where rows and column represents the level of two categorical predictor variables. This two-mode data is similar to the data that we encountered in our previous hypothetical example. The only difference is in two-mode data there are large number of rows or large number of columns, and on top of that there is only single observation per cell. For instance, here row may refer to a type of patients with as many levels as there are patients, and columns refer to type of psychotherapy with, of course, much more type of psychotherapies or treatments. In two-mode data, the standard two-way ANOVA approach cannot be used in two-mode data because of a large number of rows and or columns and only single observation per cell. So the reason is because in two-mode data we have only one observation per cell, so interaction and the residual terms are fully confounded and cannot be separated. As a result, we cannot apply standard two-way ANOVA approach to the study of interaction in two-mode data. Here I identifying whether there is an interaction in two-mode data, and if yes, then what that interaction look like is a quite challenging task. And for the sake of simplicity, I here plotted a very small two-mode data set with only 10 rows and 7 columns. And one may wonder in which of the two plots have interaction. The plot in the left panel shows there is no interaction, and I know that because this data set was generated with rows and columns main effect plus random noise, and there is no interaction. But graph in the right panel shows some interaction, and I know that because this data set was generated with rows and columns main effects plus random noise, and on top of that there are row by column cluster interaction in the data. It would be nice if methods are available that helps us to identify whether there is a true interaction in the data or the data pattern is just due to random noise. And maximal interaction two-mode clustering is one of the methods that helps us to identify whether there is a interaction in two-mode data or the data pattern is just due to random noise. And I'm going to discuss maximal interaction two-mode clustering on the next slide. This method was proposed by Schippers and his colleagues in 2017, This method yields simultaneous partitions of rows into small number of rows cluster and columns into small number of column cluster, and capture interaction parameter per by cluster rather than per cell as in standard two-way ANOVA approach. And furthermore, number of row clusters are much smaller than number of rows, and column clusters are much smaller than number of column clusters. Also, these rows and column clusters are latent, not observed just like in groups in two-way ANOVA approach. This maxint method is based on the following simple linear transformation, as you can see, where each cell entry of the data matrix is decomposed as overall mean plus row main effects denoted as alpha I, column main effects denoted as beta j, and gamma pq denotes by cluster interaction effect parameter, and finally noise is denoted as epsilon ij, follows some normal distribution. So this model is actually identifiable, and interaction pattern is interpretable, that I will show you here. Again, a panel of graph. The left panel show a true underlying interaction pattern with 3 rows and 3 column cluster, whereas graph in the right panel shows interaction where this interaction is obscured by row and column main effects plus random noise, which is normally distributed across each cell. This maxint model overcomes the limitation of standard two-way ANOVA approach, as we see, but this method has some own limitations. For instance, its results are valid only for a given sample data, and we cannot generalize our findings beyond the given sample. It provides a way of estimation of bi-cluster interaction effect parameters, but it does not provide any means to test whether the interaction pattern is, whether there is a true interaction pattern in the data or data pattern is just due to random noise. And third limitation is this method implicitly assume row cluster sizes are equal in expectation, and finally random noise is normally distributed. In this thesis, I proposed 4 studies that overcome the limitations of maxint to some extent, and here the bar length of the bar actually represents to what extent each study overcome these limitation, and I will discuss these 4 studies in a bit more detail. But first, I would like to discuss 2 statistical criteria that I used in this thesis. Depending upon whether the null hypothesis of no interaction is true or false in the population, there are 4 possible scenarios, as you can see in this table, and I selected 2 criteria given in the first row, known as false positive and true positive. A false positive occurs if we reject a null hypothesis that is actually true in the population, and a false true positive occurs if we reject a null hypothesis that is actually false in the population. And throughout this thesis, my objective was to control probability, to maintain or to control the probability of false positive decision to some threshold level called alpha, and to maximize the probability of true positive decisions, which is 1 minus beta. Now I'm going to discuss 4 studies in a bit more detail. Studies 1 and 2 both relax the first limitation and enables us to generalize our finding beyond the given sample. Both studies provides a normality based interaction test so that we enable to find out whether there is a true interaction in the data or data pattern is just due to random noise. Both studies overcome limitations of maxint, but at the same time both studies have some own limitations. For instance, study 1, again like maxint, implicitly assume row or person clusters are equal, person cluster sizes are equal in expectation, and this implicit assumption was relaxed in study 2. But study 1 and study 2 both have a common limitation, which is noise is normally distributed. So this is a common limitation in both studies. This normality assumption is rarely met in real life applications. So in study 3, I have 2 objectives. First is to investigate the performance of normality based interaction test to see whether they control the probability of empirical probability of false positive if data were or residuals were not normally distributed, and then propose a permutation based interaction test and evaluates its performance. In study 4, I applied the methodology I developed in study 3 on two-mode binary response data, and a common model for binary response data is a Rasch model. This Rasch model has two parameters. One is row main effects or subject main effect. The other one is column or item main effect, but there is no subject by item or row by column interaction in the model. So the presence of interaction in two-mode binary response data actually violates Rasch model assumptions, and tests are available in literature that helps us to detect Rasch model assumption violation. So in this study, I basically applied permutation-based interaction test that I developed in study 3 on two-mode binary response data, and then compares with some of the Rasch model-based tests that are available in some statistical packages available in software. Now I'm going to discuss conclusions of 4 studies. First, conclusions of study 1 and 2. The empirical probability of false positive decisions was under control if residuals were normally distributed. The empirical probability of true positive decisions increases with increasing the data size or sample size, and decreases with decreasing the effect size. On top of these 2 criterion, I have also some other criterion, but I'm not going into the details of these criterions. These are specifically in terms of capturing, evaluate the performance of these methods in terms of capturing interaction parameter. So in terms of capturing interaction parameter, Remaxint and eReMe study methods proposed in study 1 and 2 perform equivalently if true number of clusters are set to 2, but this is not true if true number of clusters are larger than 2, and in those cases eReMe performs better than Remaxint. Now, conclusions of study 3. In study 3, I found that the empirical probability of false positive decisions for the normality-based interaction test increases dramatically if residuals were not normally distributed, whereas in contrast, the same empirical probability or empirical probability of false positive decisions for permutation-based interaction test was under control if residuals were not normally distributed. And finally, the empirical probability of true positive decisions for normality-based, for permutation-based interaction test and for the normality-based interaction test are similar. And finally, here conclusions of study 4. The permutation-based interaction test and most of the Rasch model-based tests that I studied in this chapter perform equivalently in terms of controlling the empirical probability of false positive decisions. In terms of the empirical probability of true positive decisions for permutation-based test, and one of the Rasch model-based test called here T11 test was much higher as compared to other Rasch model-based test. So based on these some key findings, I'm going to recommend the following. The permutation-based interaction approach is preferable to the normality-based interaction approach because it control the empirical probability of false positive decisions. It has the same power as the normality-based interaction test, and it has the same computational time cost as the normality-based interaction test for a single analysis. As far as binary data is concerned, one may use T11 test to detect interaction in two-mode data, and if there are significant interaction in the data, then Remaxint or eReMe are used to interpret it. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. The opposition will now be opened by Professor Hurks, Professor of Psychodiagnostics here at this university in Maastricht, and she is also chair of the assessment committee of this dissertation.
Let's put the mic on. Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, I'm going to read my question simply because otherwise I talk too much. I hope that's okay. So, as I said, dear candidate, I read your thesis with great interest and appreciate the potential and the wide application of the techniques you discussed. Your systematic approach to studying your technique, the maximal interaction two-mode clustering, is very valuable. Also, development of tools that can be used freely aligns with the Maastricht University open science development, and I really applaud you for that. I also want to extend my congratulations to the supervisory committee. And I look forward to discussing the content of your thesis with you. And I would like to talk to you about your claim on that you expressed in your valorization chapter, so the last chapter of your thesis, in which you talk about personalized medicine. And you already open it. Yes. Before I give my question, I will give a short introduction. As a psychologist, I study the effects of cognitive training, of therapy, in really hyperactive children. So children with ADHD, they run around and we try to make them sit still a little bit via different treatments. And results of the studies in this field show that the results are often inconsistent. Some children benefit from these treatments and some don't. And I was excited to read about your chapters because while reading I thought this could be the answer, this could lead to personalized medicine. And I was really happy to see that in your valorization chapter you said exactly that this can be helpful there. However, in your suggestions on page 159, you said something that raised some questions. And on that page you said, well, it would be best if we could give everyone all treatments. So imagine that I have 3 treatments or 4 treatments that I give to each child all 4 treatments and do that in a large group of individuals and then see whether I see patterns, whether some children perform well on this treatment and some do on that. And that made me excitement because I thought, okay, let's do that. Let's collect a huge group of really hyperactive kids and imagine that I have 3 treatments. And that could be, I think, the maximum. I have 3 different treatments. And I'm wondering then, imagine that I give that to all the kids in my sample, all these 3 treatments. Do I then, and I can measure a lot of things of these children, but is that okay given your method? If I only have 3 treatments there? So I have a number of questions on that. And the first one is, would that be okay to have only 3 treatments and use, we can collect a lot of data during these 3 treatments to then use your model to see which of the children perform best after treatment 1 or treatment 2, which of the other children do that? Can you please answer that?
Yeah. Thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent, for your question. In our studies, in case of tumor data, there are typically large number of rows or columns and single observation per cell. As you describe, if there are only 3 treatments, but again it depends how many participants are there. If there are large number of participants, yes, then you can apply our methodology. But if there are, let's say there are 3 treatments and there are, let's say, a small number of participants and there are only a single observation per cell, then you can apply our method. But if in case of small number of treatments and small number of participants, you can also apply standard 2 ANOVA approach. But in this case, you must have more than 1 observation per treatment and participant combination.
Okay.
So yes, if there are, of course, as you described, there are groups of participants and there are 3 treatments. Yes, in this case, you can apply our method. And I remembered when I studied a similar type of data in my first project, but this was not directly related to this one. This was basically subject by method interaction, and there are 3 methods and there are a lot of subjects, and I applied my method on this data. But later on I removed this study from our chapter 1. So yes, you can apply our methodology on your data set.
Okay, well, that's interesting. And imagine, it's going to be a lot of work, but imagine that I include 1,000 children there. That would be great. I assume that that's already large enough. Would there then be potentially a problem that the outcomes, so the columns, that they probably are related? So if I would measure, for instance, if a child can concentrate or can sit still, That might be a practice effect if I use the same test each time. Would that be a problem in your model? So imagine that I have enough children, but I use the same test, a psychological test or an attention test. I use that several times. Would that be a problem?
As I said, if these columns are, as you explained earlier, these columns are treatments, and as you said now, there are many more children.
Yeah.
But I think so, yes, you can apply. There is no problem in our methodology.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure how it works as you describe consistency problem, and I'm not truly speaking in not very much clear about this, but I think so, yes, you can apply our method.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And then I should give all children the same order. So first treatment A, everyone. The next one, the next treatment is always treatment B. Or do you say, well, randomize that, for instance? Because I could imagine that if you learn something in treatment A, that might also impact treatment B. Perhaps would that be?
Yes, in our study, these there are rows represents subjects, and these are basically groups of subjects, and yes, columns are treatments, and for each group of subject get the same treatment.
Okay.
Yeah.
The same order then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's clear. Thank you. That helps already. Do I still have a little bit time, or do you say, well, we leave that for later? Well, I'll give the word back and we'll see if there's still time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. The opposition will be continued by Professor Keulemans, who will join us online. She is Professor of Quantitative Psychology at Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, and she is also a member of the assessment committee of this dissertation.
Dear candidates, like the previous opponent, I also read your thesis with great interest. I found that it was very clearly written, so I appreciated that. And it also includes a lot of thorough simulation results on the new methods that you provide for unraveling interaction patterns. And what I especially enjoyed was your work on the significance tests for the obtained interactions, because I think they're really needed to scrutinize actually your obtained clustering. So congratulations to you and to your supervisors. But obviously, I also prepared a number of questions for you. And the first one was that I read your thesis with interest, and I was really happy and enthusiastic about your methods. But then I came into chapter 2 in the simulation study, and I looked at your power results, and they were a bit disappointing because in most of your conditions, power was quite low, I would say. And then when I continued reading and I came to chapter 3, results were way better. So their power was in many conditions sufficient, I would say. And so my first question to you is like, why is there this difference between both chapters? Can you find an explanation for that?
Yeah, thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent, for your question. I cannot completely understand your question. I think you are talking about power in chapter 2 and power in chapter 3. So,
I was wondering whether you have an explanation for that, for the difference in power.
Yeah, in chapter 2 we basically develop a Fmax test and evaluates its performance for different data sizes and with respect to different number of rows and column clusters. Whereas in chapter 3 of this thesis, I develop a likelihood ratio test and evaluates its performance in terms of power as well as in terms of empirical type 1 error rate for different levels of data sizes and number of rows and column clusters.
So do you think that the difference might be related to the effect sizes that you put in? Because if you look at the eta squared values that you use in both studies, yeah, those values are way higher in chapter 3. So there you had values, I think, of 0.24, 0.25, and 0.10, whereas in chapter 2, they were like 1/16, so way lower. And so do you think it might be related to that? And if so, which of those values are more appropriate or more really realistic if you think of empirical data?
Much. These you are right. In chapter 2 there is a different effect size, and in chapter 3 there are two levels of effect size. And as I explained during my presentation, this power of remaxint and EREME increases with increasing the data sizes and decrease with decreasing the effect size. So for large effect size we have a large power, and for smaller effect size we have a bit smaller power.
And which of those effect sizes do you expect in real data? Is it like on the high side, like the 0.25, or is it rather 5% or so?
In real data, I think so. Maybe 10% is a reasonable effect size.
Okay, thank you. My second question is about chapter 3, where you have to impose identifiability constraints on your interaction parameters. So you have these formulas where you say that the sum of the interaction parameters for a row cluster has to be 0, and also for a column cluster it has to be 0. And in these constraints, if you look at them, you account for cluster size. And so larger clusters, you have the absolute value in there. They will be taken into account. And I was wondering, don't you think that pushes your algorithm into a specific direction? So are there specific clusterings that you expect given that you account for cluster size?
Thank you very much. In chapter 2 actually implicitly assume row cluster sizes are equal in expectation. So
no, I mean chapter 3. In chapter 3.
In chapter 3, we relax this implicit assumption and assume row cluster sizes and allow row cluster sizes are to be unequal. And in simulation study, we assume one large cluster where 70% of the rows are dedicated to one row cluster, and the remaining rows are evenly distributed across the remaining row clusters. So yes, if there are one large cluster and the remainings are evenly sized clusters, so I don't think so there is a problem in the algorithm.
Okay. What I expected is that you will find like large clusters, so with many elements in there, where you then have small interaction parameters, and that you will then end up with a few small clusters where you have large interaction effect parameters. And that is also what I see if I look at your results for the altruism data. And there you see that you have like one big cluster, and it has like a very small interaction parameters, you could say, whereas the other clusters are small and they have then larger interaction parameters. So yeah, I had the feeling that you really push your algorithm into a specific direction. Do you agree with that or not?
In person by situation case study, there is a one large cluster, and the remaining two clusters are, of course, small row cluster sizes. And if you look at the graph on the very next page after this table, it suggests there would be it requires at least 3% cluster to correctly describe the data. So yes, it would require at least 3 row clusters, not 2 or less than 2 row clusters. So it at least 3 row clusters.
Okay, thank you. I give back the word.
Much. the opposition will be continued by Professor Vermunt, who is with us online. He's Professor of Methodology and Statistics at Tilburg University and was also a member of the Assessment Committee.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidates, I also enjoyed very much reading your thesis, and I would like to congratulate you with this nice piece of work, and also congratulate your supervisors. In chapter 2, 3, and 4, you describe procedures for testing whether there's evidence for interactions. And basically, you propose a Monte Carlo simulation method to determine whether the null hypothesis that there's no interactions, or you could also formulate it as that there's only one row cluster and one column cluster. It's rejected in favor of a model with P row clusters and Q column clusters. And when I look at this at your procedure, and especially the procedure described in chapter 3, where you use the likelihood ratio test, that's very similar to what in the field of mixture modeling is referred to as bootstrapped likelihood ratio test. And I was wondering whether it would be possible to apply this tool, not only to test whether there is interactions, yes or no, let's say comparing the model with one cluster with the model with P and Q clusters, but whether it would be possible to determine the number of clusters based on this procedure. As you do in mixture modeling, there we test whether a model with K clusters holds in favor against the alternative hypothesis that there is K plus 1 clusters. So the question is, could this procedure be extended to test for the number of clusters?
Esteemed opponent, for your question. Throughout this thesis, these methods actually performs if intended user specify number of rows and column cluster, and there are two more data set, then one can apply our method to detect interaction in two more data. But as far as model selection criteria for determining the number of clusters are concerned, this is actually beyond the scope of my study. There are methods available in literature to determine number of rows and column clusters, and these criteria, for instance, include Kaiki information criteria or Bayesian information criteria, and these criterions have a likelihood plus a penalty term for complexity of the model. But in our case, classification or assignment of rows to row clusters and column to column clusters are unknown, and problem is how to include these binary 0-1 entries into the penalty term. So this was a problem in using AIC or BIC in order to determining the number of rows and column clusters. However, one may treat these, as you said, number of rows and column cluster as unknown parameters and put them in the likelihood function of the data and then try to estimate it. And to estimate those parameters, one may use, for instance, a Bayesian framework with mixture models, and these mixture priors are imposed on the mixture component. So in this way, one may determine number of rows and column cluster. But as far as my thesis is concerned, an intended user definitely specify number of rows and column cluster, and then he or she can use our method to detect interaction in their data.
Okay, thank you. So actually my second question was about the Bayesian estimation method. So you already mentioned that yourself. And indeed, I think one of the advantages would be that you can extend the framework for model selection. You can make the number of clusters in the rows and the columns, maybe even parameters that should be estimated. But do you also see other advantages of the Bayesian framework? Because one of the disadvantages, I think, is that you're using a classification likelihood approach, which requires a hard partitioning of the data across the clusters. Whereas it's quite likely that you are not also have some uncertainty about the cluster membership, but that can also affect your results.
So you are talking about a Bayesian framework instead of our classical framework?
Yeah, so what kind of advantage do you see of a possible Bayesian implementation of the maximum interaction approach?
Framework provides more accurate estimates of parameters. For instance, if we analyze some statistical distributions through classical framework or through Bayesian framework, then Bayesian estimates are more efficient in terms of smaller mean square errors. As far as our thesis is concerned, yes, one may develop or extend our approach using Bayesian methods, but as I said, it's quite a challenging task to specify priors, because as I described earlier, row classification of rows to row clusters and column to column clusters are unknown parameter, and there are a lot of unknown parameters, so it's a quite a difficult task to specify prior for each parameter in the likelihood function. So I'm not sure how one can proceed with Bayesian framework, but of course I applied classical framework. One can extend this through Bayesian framework.
Okay, thank you. Then I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you very much. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Verduin, Associate Professor of Applied Social Psychology at this university, and he was also a member of the Assessment Committee.
Thank you. Well, dear doctoral candidate, I would first of all like to congratulate you. The dissertation is really very well written. I mean, it was a pleasure to read it, and probably people often say that, but it's actually true. I really enjoyed reading it. The studies are nicely interconnected. There's a logical build-up, and for me, what is important is that you really analyze a prevalent data structure. So for applied researchers as myself, well, this is relevant, and I would like to use these methods, hopefully. Now, in order to use them, there were a few things that were not yet fully clear to me, and maybe I hope you will be able to help me when I would like to use your method in the future. The first thing relates to how to interpret the interaction you find. So what I am used to when I do a normal ANOVA analysis and I have a significant interaction, the next step I do is I do a contrast analysis to look if there are simple main effects or maybe interaction contrasts, or just to get the nature of the interaction better, right? And also actually to have p-values to know what's really differs significantly from each other. But when looking in your dissertation, I had the impression, but maybe I'm wrong, that you interpreted the interaction then between the clusters based upon a visual inspection of a plot, assuming that every difference is significant, but this is of course not necessarily the case, I think. So can you help me how to interpret exactly the interaction plots, and are there statistical tools for that to follow up on a significant interaction or not?
Yeah, thank you very much, esteemed opponent, for your question. You are right, there are two problems in literature. One is to detect interaction and the other is to interpret interaction. And our methods deals with both detection of interaction as well as interpretation of interaction. As you said, we use graphical tools to interpret interaction in two-mode data, but I'm not 100% sure how we apply contrast analysis or this type of stuff in our approach, but yes, you can apply our methods to detect interaction in two-mode data, and then there are graphical tools, and you can visualize the nature of interaction in two-mode data. As you said, how you applied our methods on your data. So these methods are available in I put the link on our website, so you can apply our codes on your data. You simply specify your two-mode data and the number of rows and column clusters. Then you will get, for instance, row partitions, column partitions, and a matrix of row by column interaction effect parameters. And on top of that, you will get test statistics value, p values, critical values, and based on these information, you accept or reject the null hypothesis of no interaction in two-mode data. So
but that's always the overall. That's the omnibus F-test, like for is there an interaction or not, right? Or do I because I am afraid if I go for, let's say, a more complex solution like three person or 3 row clusters, 3 column clusters, or 4 or 4, that I might start interpreting differences that are actually not real. You know, there is something going on because there is an overall interaction effect, but I might look at the difference, pretend there is a significance somewhere in the part of the plot, whereas in reality it's actually, well, it's not meaningful.
As I described during my presentation, our methods are dedicated to identify whether there is a true interaction in the data or data pattern is just due to random noise. There are no, because I use, when you give your data, then our algorithm removes row main effects, column main effects. So you have, basically they treat the data as a doubly centered data, so there are only interaction or random noise. So our methods efficiently detect whether there is a true interaction or the data pattern is just due to random noise. So there are no row or column main effects.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, but I was wondering about simple main effects. But maybe a second question I wanted to ask is, I know it cannot be done with the method you now developed, but I just wonder whether it could be possible with some change to the method. Because as an applied researcher, when I would have fitted, use your model, I would be a bit nervous at the end, because then I hope that, for example, the additional row information I have, for example, imagine the rows or persons, and I measured the personality of the persons, right? What I of course hope afterwards, when I compare the clusters, person clusters, or row clusters, or column, say, situation clusters, I hope they will differ on those things I measured additionally, right? Otherwise, I have clusters, but I don't really know what characterizes them outside of the strict study context, outside of, let's say, the main variable studied. But in your method, you seek for the maximum interaction in the data, so you look for a clustering that looks for the maximum interaction. I was just wondering, is it possible to balance this with the interpretability of the eventual cluster solution, so that you would seek for a model where you try to seek meaningful interactions present in the data, but already when looking for the clusters, to already implement, to use the data, the additional data you know about the rows and the columns, such that afterwards, I as an applied researcher, I don't need to be stressed at the end that my clusters will not differ on anything I have additionally measured, but I know that the method will actually look for cluster solution that takes that into account. Is that clear what I?
No,
no.
Okay.
So basically so now you seek the maximum interaction, so you cluster in order to get the maximum interaction, right?
Yes, yeah.
I wonder, is it possible to find a balance between looking for a meaningful interaction, as you currently do, but at the same time make sure in the end that your clusters differ on additional information you collected?
Additional information.
For example, personality traits of the persons, such that in the end, because now you do it in some of the studies, I think you compare the situations on in the altruism data set, like was the person alone or not alone or something, and then the clusters luckily meaningfully differed on that feature, right? But it would be frustrating if the clusters don't differ on any of the features, like that type of additional information you collected, because then it's difficult to know what's going on. So I wonder, is it possible to develop another method, an extension of a method, in order to ensure interpretability of the clusters?
Yeah, thank you very much. As far as additional information is concerned that I correctly understand, maybe you need to extend our methodology to incorporate additional information in column clusters. But as far as our approach or our studies are concerned, you have fixed number of columns, let's say 16 situation, or let's say 100 subjects or person, and then you apply our method to find out rows and column clusters, and based on our methods you interpret this subject by situation interaction. But if you want to put some additional information in there, then I think you need to extend these methods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that my time is up, so I will give the floor to the next person. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Gabriel, Assistant Professor of Methodology and Statistics at this University, Maastricht, and he's also a member of the Assessment Committee.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, as all previous opponents said, I would like to congratulate for the thesis. It was very well written and I really enjoyed reading. Also would like to congratulate your supervisory teams for the very nice work. As a statistician, I have a quick technical question, specifically about chapter 2, page 19, when specifically about the restriction that you are imposing on your model, or actually the Remaxin model, which is then developed in chapter 3 in a similar way. I was wondering here, you specifically choose a constraint which I typically refer to sum to 0 constraint, where you set the sum of these main effect parameters equal to 0, for example, 2a and 2b. I was wondering why you specifically chose this type of constraint. As for example, there are many different constraints you can use to identify the model. For example, if you can choose to set one single main effect as equal to 0, and then interpret the others as interpret that as the evidence with respect to the others. Would this affect in any way your interpretation for the parameters? Is this why, for example, you choose this specific parameterization?
Yeah, thank you very much, esteemed opponent, for your question. Yes, I choose those constraints because if, for instance, if I don't choose those constraints, then the conditional likelihood function cannot factorize into conditional likelihood for the parameters of interest and the likelihood function for the nuisance parameter. So these are the necessary constraints.
Yes, but why this specific constraint? So why not others? Is this because this was standard practice for using this type of model?
Yes, because this model is similar to the standard two-way ANOVA model, except here there are row by column cluster interaction effect parameter rather than row by column per cell parameter. So these types of constraints are typically imposed in standard two-way ANOVA approach. So this is the reason we continue the same similar type of constraint in Max-Nint approach and in Remax-Nint approach.
Okay, thank you very much. And if time allows, I have one final question, which is more about a possible extension for the work that you also mentioned at the end of, almost the end of your thesis, page 153, which is about when you briefly mentioned the possibility of having missing values in this kind of design. You specifically say that in person by situation interaction, I'm reading page 153, first paragraph, study participants may refuse to respond in some of the situations under the study. In such scenarios, the methods of the thesis are not directly applicable. And then you also tackle the possibility of dealing with what is called missing as completely at random case. So do you perhaps have an idea, or do you know some possible extension that you can working on for dealing with this kind of problem that occurs in real life application, I assume, where we have missing values, which seems to be very of interest in many applications? Do you have any possible idea how this can be done?
Yeah, thank you very much, sir, for your kind question. Sir, yes, missing data commonly occurs in social sciences or in psychological field, and this missingness may be on the dependent variable or on the independent variable, but I'm not sure how we proceed if missingness is on the independent variable. But yes, if missingness is on the dependent variable, then we may use, for instance, as I said here, missingness completely at random, or then in this case we may use missingness parameter in the likelihood function and then proceed through a Bayesian framework.
So you say the Bayesian approach could be a way to deal with this problem?
Yeah, like in missingness, we may apply a Bayesian approach to deal with missingness data. So maybe we deal with this type of missingness using Bayesian framework.
Okay, that seems okay to me. That is it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The opposition will be continued by Professor Otgaar, Professor of Legal Psychology at Maastricht University.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, I was impressed by your thesis, your focus on statistical inference for testing interaction in two-mode data. I also applaud you for coming up with these new additions for testing this approach, and I congratulate you and your supervision team, because I also see that the current work is a very interesting extension of the previous work. So before we continue, I've also read your propositions, and could you read proposition 8 to us?
Yes, thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent. The methodology discussed in this thesis provides practical guidelines to researchers in various domains who study person by situation or treatment interactions, such as personality psychology and personalized medicine and mental health care.
Thank you very much. So when I read this proposition, for me it shows that the technique, the approach that you have been studying could be practically relevant in many different domains, and that's actually also the focus of my question. I'm, like some of my colleagues here as well, I'm a more applied psychologist, and potentially interested in to see whether your approach could be used in my field. And let me explain that, because my area of expertise is not in statistics, but in psychology and law. So I'm going to give you a crash course on psychology and law. So, but I still have a strong interest in applying statistical models for applied questions in the legal arena. So for example, in my field of psychology and law, it can happen that a lawyer calls me and asks, Henry, could you work in a case in which a client of me is a suspect of a murder? And my client has been interviewed by the police in a very suggestive, a lot of pressure, and he came up with a statement, and I think this statement is not true. Can you look at this case and at the statements of the client? So that's a question I could receive from a lawyer to see whether the testimony of the suspect is true or false. So what I do, I consult the scientific literature, and luckily we legal psychologists do a little bit of work in this area, and we see when people, for example suspects, get suggestive pressure compared to people who do not, they statistically develop more false statements. So you might think, well, that's interesting, a statistically significant effect, but is it practically relevant? That's the question that I'm concerned with. Not if it's significant, but is it relevant? If I then look at the literature, I see that if someone gets suggestive pressure, on average, they come up with 0.5 false details compared to someone who did not receive such a question. 0.5, I don't think that's really interesting. It can be significant, but not really interesting. So why do I say this now? Because in my field of psychology and law, we are very interested in effect sizes, and especially which effect size, the smallest one, is of interest to us. And if effects are larger than the smallest effect size of interest, then this might be relevant for this case, theoretically, practically. in your thesis, you mention that your approach suffers from some limitations which you try to address, like the absence of a significant test for interaction. And you have devised an interesting way to test these null hypothesis interactions. And I'm wondering, in my field, I can imagine that your approach can be used. For example, there is so much data in which people, which would be the rows, have been asked zillions of questions, which could be a column. And for each question, you get an answer, whether or not they come up with a statement or not. But I'm not interested in this p-value that you can get from your beautiful, maybe R package. I want to know whether it is practically relevant, what I find. So I'm wondering, can you use your method to see whether what you find, your interaction, is practically relevant? And then I'm thinking, for example, about this smallest effect size of interest, and how can you help me if I'm asked by a lawyer again next time?
Yeah, thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent. I think practical statistical significance and practical significance are two different things. Yes, once you applied our methods on your data, and of course your data is satisfied the conditions of 2 more data, then you will get test statistics and critical values, not p-values. P-values are optional, and based on test statistics and critical value, you may reject or not reject your null hypothesis of no interaction in 2 more data. And I think this address the problem you are talking about, because it actually addresses statistical significance in the data, but I'm not sure how to practically. Yes, our methods also deals with interpretation of interaction in 2 more data. So there are graphical plots, and maybe you can use these graphical plots to see whether there is the interaction has a practical significance or not.
Yeah, thank you. I think your answer, I was thinking about this as well when I was reading your thesis, some sort of visual inspection of the plot, but then I got stuck. On which basis should I do that? I'm just wondering. I mean, because I think the technique is very interesting, and like I said, I think I potentially could use that for some of the questions you're interested in. But for example, if I look often at unstandardized effect sizes, 0.5, I'm not interested in an eta squared value or Cohen's d, which is interesting. No, I'm interested in unstandardized. How many details does a suspect remember or not? And I'm wondering, is there something I could do with that plot that you're mentioning in these terms? And maybe not, but just wondering.
Yeah, our plots are basically used to interpret interaction in 2 more data, and they may be used to justify practical significance in your data. But of course, you can use test statistics, and then statistically you can justify your claim.
Okay, maybe we can talk later. I'm just interested also with your supervisor. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Perhaps Professor Keulemans, do you want to ask one more question? I think you're mute. We don't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. So in your models, you impose some assumptions on the data, and you look into these assumptions in chapter 4, where you focus on the normality assumption. But I was wondering about the homoscedasticity assumption. So what happens if that assumption is violated? So if the errors are not identically distributed in the different clusters?
Yeah, thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent, for your question. If normality assumption is not met, then As I explained in my presentation, the empirical probability of false positive decisions increases dramatically for the methods I develop in study 1 and 2. So we need some additional method that enables us to control the empirical probability of false positive decisions to some threshold level. And for this reason, I proposed a permutation-based approach in chapter 3, and this permutation-based approach performed really well in terms of controlling the empirical probability of false positive decisions.
Okay, but that was about...
I think that came just before another question, so I'd like to quit it here. The time, Dr. Zaheer Ahmed, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
Thank you very much.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose that branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. Better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. east side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile or not. What's on the line? I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. 'Cause I'll go the extra mile.
additionally.
Zaheer Ahmed, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor van Breukelen is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with the Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor. And at the same time, I ask if somebody can take picture while the degree is handed out.
Do you promise to work in accordance with principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Zaheer Ahmed, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the Rector, the Secretary and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university. So here I'm happy to congratulate you also on behalf of your daily supervisors, Jan and Alberto. Jan will do the laudatio, but before he does, let me first take the opportunity to thank our both external opponents, Professor Eva Keulemans from University of Leuven and Professor Jeroen Vermunt for the University of Tilburg, for being here with us today and for assessing your thesis. Your work is much appreciated. Thank you, and we're very sorry you can't make it being here today and that you will miss the dinner. At least you have the consolation you don't have to use our public transport today. Okay, thank you again. Bye-bye. I'll give you...
Dear Zaheer, you were born in Rawalpindi, Pakistan, and today you are standing here in Maastricht, the Netherlands, where you have successfully defended your PhD thesis entitled Statistical Inference for Maximal Interaction Two-Mode Clustering. You have made considerable sacrifices and had to overcome obstacles to get to where you are now, as I will explain later. But first, I wish to focus on the result of your research efforts over the last 4 years. Your dissertation represents an innovative contribution to the field of two-mode clustering by further developing these methods such that they can be applied for detecting and understanding statistical interaction in two-mode data. As you explain in your thesis, it is a challenge to study interaction in such data because its structure precludes the application of standard statistical methods. Your dissertation includes 8 chapters, 4 of which each correspond to a different scientific paper that has been or will be submitted to a scientific journal for publication as a research article. Your first paper has been published in Advances in Data Analysis and Classification, and I am happy to announce that your second paper which is based on chapter 3 of your dissertation, has been accepted for publication in the Journal of Classification, conditionally on a very minor revision. This is a great achievement if we take into account that it is not exceptional to see a period of 6 months or more between the submission of a paper to a statistical journal and receiving a first review. With these accomplishments and the rest of your dissertation, you have shown that you deserve to stand here today to receive from Maastricht University the title of doctor. The last 4 years have been a difficult period for you, Zaheer, as your wife and 2 children were at home in Pakistan and you missed them a lot. Your daughter, in fact, was born while you were here in Maastricht, and for the first couple of months you could only see her in video calls. I remember that you initially had plans to bring your family to the Netherlands once you had settled in comfortably in this country and in your new work. Unfortunately, in your 2nd year here, the corona pandemic broke out, which understandably changed your plans. You did not want to move your family to a foreign country where they would have to live in isolation for who knows how long. I am glad that you are finally reunited now, and I am sure you are enjoying every minute of it. Aside from the sacrifices you made, the corona pandemic also presented obstacles on your professional path. When the first lockdown was announced, you were working on mathematical derivations, some of which are presented in chapter 3 of your dissertation, and we were unable to physically meet to discuss your work. Now, you and I, we share the same need to work with pen and paper when thinking about mathematical problems. So you had no other option than to take pictures of your work with your phone and send those to me. I printed them, wrote my own notes on top, made a scan of the result, and then sent everything back to you, where the process could start all over again. Very difficult circumstances. Oh, and did I mention that just before the lockdown, Maastricht University was more or less recovered from a cyber attack that took down many university facilities for a number of weeks. Unfortunately, this included access to MATLAB, which is the software you were using at that time for your research. Despite these obstacles, you managed to complete your dissertation on time. You never complained and kept pursuing your goals with dedication and resilience. I admire you for that. This brings me to think about characteristics that you will be remembered for in our department and that are not related to your academic accomplishments. Some may remember you to be highly skilled in optimal packing. I too witnessed this when we attended a conference in Bologna last summer, where you managed to pack into a standard backpack all your clothes, including a suit to be worn for your presentation, as well as a laptop. Yes. Others may perhaps remember you for your skill level in snooker or billiards, which led to victories among friendly but competitive PhD student games. However, what I will remember the most is your courteousness, showing consideration and respect for those around you. If I had to describe you by one distinctive feature, it would be that you do not wish to impose yourself on anyone. Illustrative for that is your silent knock on the door. It's the gentlest knock I have ever heard. Dear Zaheer, I wrote this laudatio on behalf of your supervision team that also includes Professor Gerard van Breukelen and Dr. Alberto Cassese. All 3 of us wish you every success with your life and with your future career. We are happy to congratulate you with obtaining your PhD, and it is our pleasure to extend these congratulations to your family and friends. We are sure they are very proud of you, as are we. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, dear Dr. Ahmed. Also on behalf of the Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. And before I close down, I like to say that we stay here for you to make a picture with the online opponents in the background, so right here. After that, there's always taken a picture of the corona and the candidate at the stairs, and after that, we congratulate you in the museum.
Right.
Okay, so I now can close this academic meeting.